Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, this is Eleanor.
And this is Lisa.
And as you know, this is the What's Your Grief podcast. How's it going, Lisa?
Oh, it's going. Same old. I feel like people keep asking me that question, and I keep struggling to come up with a innovative answer.
Right. Well, there's less on the surface, less practical and like tasky type of things that you can say you've done or are doing or are looking forward to doing. Because right now, with the social distance, I think that every day looks pretty similar to the day before in many ways.
It is so true. I went to the pharmacy today, and it really felt exciting. It really felt exciting.
I hear you. If there's one thing to do on a day, it's kind of like a really bright spot, unless it's something I'm dreading. But like, it's funny because before all this happened, I was looking at my calendar with like myself and all the kids stuff and thinking like, oh my gosh, how am I going to like fit everything in? And then literally like now the calendar on the wall is 100% blank. There is literally nothing on the calendar. It's like, it's nice, but it's also like, I don't know how to act. I don't know what to do with
Oh,
myself.
absolutely. It's a completely new way of trying to figure out how to exist in the world.
Right,
with
and that is
it's
takes
tough.
Yeah. So one thing though that I think we both have in common that has been helping us to pass the time is a little television and movie consumption.
Yes, yes.
So we always like to start off by talking about anything we've seen or read or heard that is possibly grief adjacent. So you got anything?
So I mean, the first thing that I will mention, I know we've both watched it, and I watched it immediately following the last podcast where we talked about grief shows, and I was really disappointed I hadn't watched it before, is the Netflix show, Never Have I Ever.
Yes. Good show. Definitely just finished it, I think a couple days ago. I really did like this show. It was very good. It's a young adult show. So you may be wondering why two women in their late 30s are watching it, but
No judgment.
it's for the grown-ups too. It's good.
It is good, and I will say, as a grown woman with no young adult children to have even watched it with, I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I think it really did tackle grief themes for young adults in a way that really felt both real and sort of accessible and not so in your face that they were overwhelming.
Yes. The tone was it just felt like real life. Like it didn't have that after school special vibe to it at all. It had it really, for me, like of course parts of it were exaggerated, just the characters and things like that to make it funny and interesting. But to me it felt a lot like what we often see with grief is that it just happens alongside everything else that's already happening, and you cannot like grieve in a bubble. It doesn't stop everything. You still have to go through with all your, all your day-to-day things. And for teenagers, that means a lot of things because they're doing their school things and their extracurricular things, and they're also doing all those developmental and identity formation types of things. And so I thought it was cool to see a story where they made it very abundantly clear that she was really focused on doing many of these teenage things, and it may possibly have been to the service of avoiding some of her grief and what was going on emotionally or within her family. But they still showed that she was trying to navigate a world socially at school and academically and thinking of a forward to college. So I really appreciated that it seemed like a more like realistic and accessible depiction, even though it's definitely a work of fiction.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that the one thing I appreciated too about the family dynamic that they showed that I think is something we hear from not just teenagers at all, definitely adults for sure, but it definitely comes up with teenagers, is this experience in the family where the main character in the show, she is an only child, and the parent who has died is really the parent who she had the very, very close, tight connection with. And so now she's sort of left with the other parent and navigating that. And I think, as we were kind of talking about before we first started recording, there's this feeling that comes up for I think a lot of adults and teenagers and kids and anyone who's gone through this, of just thinking about the other parent and wishing
Yeah.
that it had been different, or what would it have looked like, what would life
Right.
be if it had been different. And it kind of tackles that in a pretty head-on way,
Yeah.
that I really appreciated about the show. And I think it looks at it from both, it tackles it both from the perspective of the daughter and the mother. So I like that.
I agree. I think that in any family, everybody involved takes a role. And when there are two parents involved or more parents, there's sort of this division of who's going to do what. Who's going to be maybe the more practical parent who deals with all the maybe logistics of things? Who's going to be the disciplinarian? Sometimes it's the good cop, bad cop. And you definitely got the sense that the more nurturing good cop was the one who died. And so the mother was, still a great mother, but trying to figure out how she's going to step into these roles, in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, she's not going to replace her husband and the girl's father who died, but how can she maybe help to meet some of her daughter's needs that are no longer being met? And you could see that it was really a struggle. And this mother was somebody who stays, you can tell she's somebody who has her crap together, right? She wants to be really strong and not show any weakness and sort of plows on ahead. And so we were talking earlier about the scene where she meets with the daughter, the main character is the daughter, meets with her therapist. And the therapist is saying, like, you don't always have to be so strong and put together. And it might actually be beneficial for you to have a little vulnerability and show a little bit of your emotion and maybe even have that breakdown. And I think so many parents, this is something we talk about all the time with parents who are grieving while also supporting a child and taking care of a child, is that it's not necessarily going to be detrimental for you to show your grief. Even if you think you've gone overboard in showing your grief, there's that idea of rupture and repair, right? So even if you have a moment that feels like really too much, you can still have that moment where you revisit it with your child and connect with them and talk it through. And that repair can be really, really beneficial, even if you feel like it's been too much when you share your vulnerabilities. So I appreciated that the therapist said, like, literally what we would have said to the mother.
I had the exact same thought in watching that scene, of just thinking this is so much what we would say, and also this is so much an experience that I think a lot of parents relate to and struggle with, because we hear this question from people so often, of worrying about letting their kids see any emotion at all from them. And I think that's a real fear. We don't get a handbook. We don't know how to, what we're supposed to do or not supposed to do when it comes to parenting in general. It's not that there's a guidebook, and certainly in parenting while you're grieving. So I think it really captured a lot of that well.
Yeah. So agreed. Good show.
Yeah. How about you? What else? Anything interesting you're watching?
Um, well, I did see a show that I had me thinking. It wasn't a grief show at all, actually. It is the show that is currently on ESPN called The Last Dance, and it is about the Chicago Bulls. Don't quote me here, but I think it was the 98 season where they were going for their sixth championship and within a decade. Please don't get too mad at me. I don't know all the sports details. I like a lot of ESPN's documentary 30 for 30 type of content because it really does bring in the human element of things.
Absolutely. I agree. I love them for the same reason.
So but I'm not a sports person, though I know many people are watching this because it's really filling a sports hole for a lot of people in their lives who are not getting that live sports content that they're used to. I'm very sorry. Anyways, this past weekend, they aired 2 episodes, and one of them was about after the Bulls and after Michael Jordan won his third championship in a row. He had a really traumatic experience, and you may remember this, and some people listening may remember this. His father was driving and pulled over on the side of the road late at night, they think, to take a nap or get some rest, and he was somehow attacked. They stole his car, and he was murdered. And so he went through this really profound loss after his third championship, like pretty soon afterwards. And his father had always been really close to him and had been by his side and was there for like everything. He was really close with both his parents, especially his father. And so it was interesting because they were talking a lot about this, what happened at the time, and then interviewing him in present day. And at the time, there was all this speculation after all this happened because he announced that he was going to retire from basketball, kind of like at his peak, right? He still had plenty of good years left in him, but he decided to retire and go play baseball all out of the blue. And so there was all this speculation at the time about whether he was secretly suspended by the commissioner of the league for gambling and, you know, what was going on. Why is he stepping away? When hearing his interviews in the moment, it just seemed so clear, though he never said this. And so this is really just my interpretation, watching it through my lens. It really just seemed that he was like grieving, and he stepped away because he had experienced this really traumatic loss. So there was 2 things going on, it seemed. One was that close to when all this happened. So probably one of the more recent and last conversations he had with his father, he was talking about after he's done with basketball, he thinks he might want to go give baseball a try. They make it clear he always wants a new challenge and something that he's working towards. And his dad was like, yeah, you should do that. That would be like a good plan, good idea. And so this was like kind of where he left things off with his dad. And at the same time, because his dad had been by his side throughout his whole career, it just really felt kind of wrong to keep doing what he was doing. And they made it clear he was just also like so tired and worn out just from working so hard for so long, and he just stepped away. And it's interesting because at the time it seemed like everybody was like so perplexed and scratching their heads, but like his dad had just been murdered. And so it's interesting because it does seem like he wanted to carry through with that conversation he had with his dad. Maybe because that's what his dad thought was going to happen. That was the plan that he made with his dad. Or maybe it felt like a promise or something. This is totally me guessing. I don't know. I obviously don't know this. I'm not personal friends with Michael Jordan, though I wish I was. But it really seems like it was kind of that continuing bonds type of thing, or like this is what my loved one thought was going to happen, or they thought this was a good idea for me. And then he does come back a year and a half later. So he's not quote unquote over his grief, but he definitely had some time away from basketball to do something different, to have a change of scene, and to maybe focus on some other things. So after a year and a half, he comes back. And even when he came back, he's famous for wearing the number 23. But the first game back, he said, I'm not wearing 23 anymore. And he wore his baseball number instead, because a lot of people were saying in the documentary, and I think he even said himself, it felt wrong to wear 23 without my dad being there. So it's just interesting. I'm kind of interested to hear if anybody else is watching, what their take was. Did they have similar thoughts about like, yeah, duh, he's like grieving. This is like a major, profound, traumatic loss type of experience, and it makes total sense. So I'm interested. You can tweet us if you had a similar experience when you were watching it, but it was interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I think it makes so much sense. I think that the idea that we do feel a connection with the life that we that we believe our loved one thought we were going to lead, and that if that conversation with his dad, if he sort of felt like that was this meaningful conversation and his dad really connected with this idea that this might be his next path, I can see how it would become incredibly important to him to sort of maintain that,
Right.
and might maybe use that as a connection
Yeah.
with his dad as part of his grief. So it sounds really good. I love 30 for 30s, so I am definitely going to watch.
You should. You should definitely check it out. As I know, we both graduated in the late 90s from high school, and so there's a lot of nostalgia in there. The soundtrack is very nostalgic, and there's a lot of things that you just kind of remember from growing up. So, yeah, even if you're not a sports fan, it's worth a watch. It's good.
I'm sold.
Okay.
I've got some evening free time on my hands, so
Yeah.
well, the only other show that, I was going to mention to you that I really think you would like, but I know you have not seen, I've been watching The Leftovers.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a non-traditional grief show. It's
Okay.
got a little bit of a fantasy. I mean, it's like
Right.
clearly not something, that's a traditional way. And this is not a spoiler to say this is a show about people disappearing.
Mhm.
And the premise of the show is that 140 million people have just suddenly disappeared off the planet. And people don't know, did they die? Where did they go? It's a big unknown. And so the show really kind of deals with ambiguous grief and what happens when people have, just disappeared, these unknowns, this chronic uncertainty. And it's a great show in that it plays out and I think really looks at how that might play out differently for different people. And so you really see that in this town and in the ways people find to cope. So I think that's really interesting. But without getting into the nitty gritty of the show, one of the things I also just really appreciate about the show is the show covers this long time span, in that from when this event happened where all these people have lost their loved ones, the show ends 7 years later. And one of the things that they do really well without being overdone or even making it dramatic that it's a thing is they just show how much 7 years later that everyone is still being impacted in different ways by these losses, and the way that new things in life are coming up that are impacting them in different ways around the losses, and people are still trying to find new and different ways to cope with what's happened to them and readjust and integrate things in their lives in different ways. So I just really appreciated in a world where I think we often hear people saying, I feel like people are rushing my grief and they think I should be over it in 6 months or a year, or, these sorts of things that should
Mhm.
have happened, to just see a show that really acknowledges without being overdone the idea that grief, it's a long haul.
So, question, because I have not seen it. Theoretically, if that many people left, was everybody, were all the quote unquote leftovers grieving? Was like pretty much everyone grieving?
Yeah. So, I mean, the premise of the show is that basically
Most
everyone
people.
was
Yeah.
either directly or indirectly impacted.
Yeah.
Everyone certainly knew someone who
Right.
disappeared.
Well, just makes me think, because we wanted to talk today about the sense that it's been long enough, or it's been too long, or has it been too long, or is it too late, or it's never too late. So that sense that there is maybe a time frame, and the reality that there isn't a time frame. And I think it's interesting that in a show where pretty much everyone's grieving, everyone's able to acknowledge, oh, you know what, this doesn't end. But in a world where many people don't get it, or haven't been through it, or have been through it and maybe still buy into some of society's norms that they set around this, we don't have that acceptance for it. We do have this sense that, like, oh, you're still doing that? That's still your
Yeah.
thing? We're all past that. We're all moving on. Or, why haven't you moved on? Or why aren't you feeling better? Why aren't you normal again? So I think it's interesting because we definitely have that here. People who
Yeah.
are, even people who are grieving, internalize this sense all the time that they shouldn't be grieving anymore. We see it all the time.
Oh, absolutely. And what's interesting, now that you mention that, and this is interesting because I don't think I had consciously thought it in watching the show, but you saying that just brought it up for me. In addition to the time and the idea that maybe because everyone is grieving, they're able in this, in this universe of the show to allow space for it to continue longer. Also, there's a level of people's forgiveness or generosity or compassion towards one another for the
Mhm.
completely outlandish ways that they're trying to cope and like struggling with their grief.
Yeah.
So the ways that it's manifesting and the things that people are doing to try to cope in a world where maybe the rest of their support, the rest of the people in their lives weren't also coping with something, you could see that people's tolerance
Yeah.
for it might be a lot lower
Right.
than in this sort of world they've created where at the same time lots of people are floundering around trying to find ways to cope and make sense of the world. So it does
Right.
offer this um, interesting way to explore what would it look like if lots of people were kind of
Yeah.
grieving a really intense, extreme, unexpected loss
Right.
all at the same time.
Well,
Uh,
and which is interesting considering where we are now today, because I do think that we have this sense of, not everybody's grieving the same gravity of loss, but most people are understanding it and feeling some sort of element of loss. And so I think it's interesting because we do see this in a way, this collective compassion and coming together. But at the same time, we see a lot of conflict and disagreement over how people should be handling things and doing things. And so I think that's interesting.
yeah,
And it leads perfectly, like I said, into what we wanted to talk about today, which is that sense that sometimes we feel like it's too late. And when we started talking about this in preparation for this podcast, it made me think of a couple of times where we have done groups. And our groups that we do at a shelter here in Baltimore, are open to everybody, no matter what's going on in their lives. And I can think of so many instances where people would come to the group and say, my loss was 5 years ago. My loss was 15 years ago. My loss was when I was a child. Can I still be here? And so I think a lot of times people have this sense that they can't continue to access support, which I believe the precipitating thought there is that I should not still be grieving. I shouldn't still be needing support for this loss.
absolutely. That I've passed some magic time frame where I was supposed to have dealt with this and moved on and gotten better. And so if I still need support, that's a problem. And I think one of the things we try to always reassure people in that situation where they come into group asking that question is that you can always come and access support. It is never, ever too late because our grief comes up for us in different ways across our lifespan, right? I mean, that we have these losses and there's no question in the beginning. It is often the time, not always, but often the time that it is the most overwhelming and the hardest to carry. And we're feeling, these intense emotions. And sometimes we really kind of do the things that we need to do to learn to cope and adjust and carry the weight of that pain with us in effective ways. Sometimes we do that early on. Sometimes we don't do that early on, and
Mm.
sometimes time passes and we really don't quite develop the the coping skills, or maybe we don't deal with some of the difficult emotions that we were stuck on early in that grief. And so sometimes later we do need to go back and revisit a lot of the stuff that didn't happen early on after that loss.
Yeah, and I think what we know and what I'm guessing most people on this podcast know is that, like you just said, it's not only okay, but it's very normal to want and need support around your losses years later. And I think what happens over time is that our safe spaces for acknowledging our grief and for getting that, they feel a little bit fewer and far between. They get smaller, and I think some days we feel like we can claim our grief. Mother's Day just passed, and that's one in particular where you might feel like on a random Tuesday you can't blame things on your grief. You can't say I'm just really struggling. I'm having a tough day because of your grief. I'm not saying that's true, but you may feel that way. But then on Mother's Day or an anniversary or birthday, those are the days where you're like allowed to really fully feel it.
Yeah.
And so I think that our days and our times and our spaces where we feel like we can acknowledge our grief become fewer because we have people in our lives who are looking at us like, are you still going through that? Are you still dealing with that? Like, why aren't you over it? We may feel like we don't feel comfortable because we feel like embarrassed or whatever it is, even though you shouldn't. Many of us do at times when we feel vulnerable. So I think that's what happens. So I think one of the things that we always recommend is looking for those spaces that do acknowledge that grief is an ongoing thing that lasts forever, and that even though you might have been feeling fine a year ago, and when I say fine, I mean, baseline, okay, a year later something's happened and now you're feeling really bad and you want to revisit things. And so I think looking for those spaces like support groups that are not just for maybe early on, not
Mhm.
just for like first year people who are grieving. Therapists, if most therapists should be normalizing the experience, if they're not, you might want to push back on that, or look elsewhere for a therapist, because therapists should be normalizing that we can be still processing and exploring these things years later. And then the people who do get it, so the other leftovers, right? So the friends and the family members who understand that this is something that goes on for a long time. And many times these are not the people we expected them to be. So our safe space might not be our partner when we need to talk about our grief years later. Our safe space might be our friend who we connect with over grief, or a family member who is also really still feeling it or understands what it means to be grieving years later. So I think that it's just the way we are right now in our society, and I think it's getting better. But as people who are grieving, I think just knowing that we are deserving of that support and finding the right places to find it is really essential.
Absolutely. And that when those moments in life come up that bring it up again, knowing that it is so normal and that we can tend to it without hopefully judgment of thinking, oh, this must mean if I was feeling okay for a year and now it's come up, I must not have really dealt with it a year. I thought I dealt with it, but I didn't,
Hmm.
right? No, that's not how it works. We
Right.
regrieve, new things come up, new life events. And I think, with that, it allows us a space to say we can always get help and support when we need it. And also, it might mean we can also reach back out to other people in our lives, or other ways of accessing maybe things that we
Sure.
wanted that might be helpful to us in this moment, where suddenly we
Hmm.
now have a feeling of, oh, it would be helpful to maybe reconnect with a certain person or learn certain things about my loved one, or do certain things. That those things can often feel helpful, but sometimes we tell ourselves the story that it's too late for that too.
Oh, yeah, especially when it comes to people, right? I think that if we lose touch with somebody for whatever reason, I can't even identify a really good one for myself. I'm saying anecdotally, why not to reach out to somebody? But I do think that there's this fear. I don't know if it's a fear of awkwardness or a fear of rejection, or just maybe a feeling that it's too much or too much effort. But I do think that for some reason, when it comes to people, we're very hesitant to bridge gaps that exist.
I think it's very true. And I think sometimes it's a little bit of that. Also, there's that unknown or expectation. I think for me, one of the things that sometimes becomes hard, and this has come up in a very personal way for me recently. My sister and I were just talking about how we've lost touch with some of our dad's family that we regret
Mhm.
losing touch with. And my sister's boyfriend who died, losing touch with some of his family that we regret, but also not being quite sure if we reach out, like, what's the expectation? Like, what do I
Right.
want out of that relationship? What am I really looking for? And somehow feeling like I need to have some fully crystallized idea in
Yeah.
my mind about what that is before I can reach out. And I think that ends up being a barrier sometimes that's unnecessary. Thinking, well, it's been so
Yeah.
long. If I'm going to reach out, it needs to be with this kind of specific idea of what it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I think that we all have these feelings about how relationships should be, especially when it comes to family. And so I bet you a lot of times it's like, well, if it isn't going to be like a close family relationship, like what's the point? Or like they'll just disappoint me, or like we have these expectations and these maybe need to define what it's going to look like or know what it's going to look like. When in reality, we have so many just interactions that are maybe, fly by night and you know, just passing interactions that are not necessarily going to be like lasting deep relationships, but it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily worth it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, that idea that it doesn't, reaching out and reconnecting and saying, hey, this came up and I've just been thinking about you. Maybe you say in connection with your loved one who died,
Mhm.
maybe you don't, but that it can just be, maybe I just wanted to check in, or maybe it is that you're wishing that you could, maybe it's somebody had some memories or stories or something about your loved one that you
Mhm.
wish that you could hear about. And maybe it's just being very direct and saying like, hey, I've been thinking
Yeah,
about my sister a lot lately, and I know that you spent those years as her roommate, or did those, and like I would just love to, if you don't mind, hear some stories that
yeah,
about that, like being very, and then maybe that's it, you just kind of touch in and touch
right.
out again, and that's absolutely okay.
Yeah, and so maybe it's part of it is sort of investing a little less in the outcome and the long term and enjoying it or taking the value from the experience regardless of what it is. And even if that experience is negative, um, you've learned something from that, right? And I think that this is something I think about too with people who maybe didn't do their best in their mind when they were supporting someone who's grieving. So maybe a friend or family member who feels as though they messed up when when they should have been there for somebody. And so I think that there's this fear that the person I wasn't there for won't forgive me or won't let me back in their life, or they'll be mad at me. And that all might be true. It might not be the most pleasant
Mhm.
experience because you might have to be face to face with the fact that you messed up. But there's still maybe value in saying, like, I'm sorry, or I know I messed up and I've been thinking of you and I'm here if you're ever ready. So I think that we maybe need to detach ourselves a little bit from those fear of those negative consequences or things not living up to our expectation and just take it for what it is sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that, having, again, the ambiguity or the unknown of those relationships hanging out there open, if you're worrying, oh, this person might be mad at me, or I didn't do my best to support them, or I
Yeah.
really screwed those things up. The unknown of that is, it's hard
Mhm.
too. And so
Right.
I think, though that anxiety of confirming our worst
Yeah.
fears is difficult, the worst that happens is we confirm what we were already worried about anyway,
Right. Yeah, it's like
which
procrastination a little bit, and that's like avoidance, and what happens when you do those things is they haunt you. They, like, follow you around, making you feel bad on a daily
exactly.
basis.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think with that, like there is that risk of that thing that you're trying to avoid, that you're scared might be true. But on the other side, there's a potential really big reward, which is that it could be that you can repair that relationship.
Right.
Or maybe that person, they may not be thrilled with how you ghosted them in their grief, but
Mhm.
they may be in a place where they're able to,
Right.
hear that apology and revisit that relationship. And so, I think in that situation, and as someone who not too terribly long ago, within the last few years, reached out and apologized for something I really screwed up in a friendship and not being a great friend to another person. And ultimately, I'm really grateful that now a relationship that hadn't existed for years exists again. And I'm really glad that I did that. And there was a big risk that went with that. I was really worried. But I
Mhm.
think to me in that moment, it was like, okay, I'll find out one way or the other.
Yeah.
And luckily, in that case, for me, it ended up being a really good thing. So,
Yeah. Sure.
yeah.
Definitely. Um, some other, I think, ways that this comes up for people is the sense that maybe, early on when you are grieving, you have this sense that, like, is this how things are for me now? Like, is this who I am now? Is this how I'm celebrating the holidays now? Is this what I am? Oh, now I'm the person who doesn't acknowledge birthdays and things like that. And I think also recognizing that in the very beginning, like you're just doing what you have to do to survive. And there are things that can wait and can come later in terms of coping and connection. I was thinking it's sort of like we talk about how a loss is often like a hurricane or a tornado or a big storm blew through and leveled everything. And when you come back out, you are really left with maybe a foundation, but you have to figure out how to rebuild your life. It's never going to be the same. You have to rebuild it different. And I feel like year one's kind of like phase one of building. Like it's like, okay, making sure I have like a roof over my head and the very basics. And like some of these other coping and connection pieces, maybe phase two. And phase it takes
Totally.
time to get to phase two. Does that am I insane or does that make sense? I don't know.
Oh, no, that
Yeah.
absolutely makes sense. I think that's exactly what happens for a lot of people. But I think sometimes we don't realize that that's what's happening. I think
Right.
because it's happening incrementally,
Yes.
like like day by day, like we're getting a little bit stronger and things are changing a little bit, but we're still having like ups and downs and good days and bad days. And we oftentimes in grief don't realize that we're moving. Like we
Yeah.
don't realize that that's happening. So we don't know that we're in this place where now maybe some of the things that were impossible and inaccessible and overwhelming and awful back in that
Mhm.
first phase, like those things are they're not easy things, but they're going to be different. They're going to
Mhm.
feel different now because we're different now
Yeah.
and we've been moving along in ways we didn't even necessarily
Right.
realize.
Yeah, that's it's like there's just like people don't think about it in that way, but it's like grief is like there's just like building blocks. Like you're just not ready that you're just not there yet. You're not ready yet for so many things. Like it's like you're not you need to keep moving. You need to keep it moving
Yeah,
until you can get to that place where you maybe feel like you can stand tall enough to reach those things or where you're ready to like build, a second floor or whatever metaphor you
whatever
enjoy
metaphor we're working with.
personally. But yeah, no, I think that is so true. And I think people feel like, oh, okay, I feel okay, so I'm done. But no, it's not necessarily that you're done. Maybe because you have when you have a primary big loss, you have so many secondary losses. Maybe when you're feeling stable about the primary losses, when you start to go and reclaim and rebuild and reestablish some of those secondary things that you lost. Like you may never get it back to the way it was, but these might be some things that you can have back in a sense, in a way.
Absolutely. And I think if there are places, I think for me, I think thinking where we hear this from people so often is if there were things early on where they just very clearly have these sometimes really distressing memories of I went somewhere where I thought it was going to be comforting because it's where I used to go with my loved one, or I wanted to do this thing that we used to do together, what various things. And then suddenly the emotion that went with that
Mhm.
was so debilitating that people just sometimes shut the
Yeah.
door to that and think I'm never going to open that door again.
Right.
Like that is a scary, scary door. What is behind there is something that I don't want. And again, it sort of goes back to the same that avoidance of maybe reaching back out to somebody and the idea that there's a risk reward.
Mhm.
I think is kind of similar here as well, right? That risk is still there. It's still going to
Right.
be it's we're not saying it's going to be easy, right?
Sure.
It's still going to be complicated.
Eh,
It's still going to be hard. It's still going to be
and it
emotional. It's
may
still going to be
you may do it, you may try it and be like, that was a mistake, and
oh yeah,
that's it.
you may slam the door again
Yeah,
and
and
be
it's
like,
like,
okay,
not for me anymore, you
yeah.
know?
But the other possibility is that you're able to now revisit it in this new way, as a person who
Yeah,
has kind of changed in different ways and gotten
yeah,
stronger. And so it's still going to be painful, but you may be able to carry that pain differently that now allows you to also access the good things, like the good
right.
memories of the whole reason that you used
Yeah,
to go to that place and the comforting connection you might feel with your loved one there, and all of those things. So
yeah,
it's never too late, I think, to just think back
mhm,
and say, are there things where maybe I shut the door to it, and by doing that I'm not able to connect with some maybe good positive memories,
Right.
and maybe I can use some space now to do that. It's never too late.
Here.
I mean, I think that's our theme for the day, for all of
Yes.
these, is it's hard, they're hard, but, time passes and it's never too late to go
It's never too
revisit.
late to honor and recognize your grief, and it's never too late to find support and coping for your grief. And just
Absolutely.
recognize that this is a thing that is a part of you in many ways. And though it may not feel like a part of your everyday after a decade or 2 decades or however long, it still may feel like a thing at times. It may be one day out of the year, but it's still okay when that happens to do your thing. So, with that,
Absolutely.
I think that we will wrap up for the day, but we will also ask you to share with us your experience. You can reach us on all social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, at What's Your Grief. And then also you can email us with any questions or definitely with podcast topic suggestions at podcast@whatsyourgrief.com. Until next
See you next time.